All right, we're good to go. I'm gonna mute up. Actually, give me 1 second.
Yep.
All right, we are golden. Go.
Awesome.
Let me turn on Instagram really quick, and
Turn on, flip
you
all
guys
the
are good to
switches.
go.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Quinn. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody who's tuning in. Super excited to be here with Anika Manzoor with Youth Activism Project. We're going to have a really great conversation today, just talking through this work that, Anika's been doing for, I think, something like 20 years, is what I saw. So there's a lot, I think, of history to hear about and a lot of good work happening. With Good Party, we've been hosting these AMAs about every month, with fellow organizations in the democracy reform space who are doing great work, so we can kind of connect the dots between all the different work that we do. So we're super excited to have Anika here to share the awesome work that you and your folks are doing. So would love just for you to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into more about what it is that the organization's doing, and then we got a ton of great AMA questions that we're going to dive into. So yeah, welcome. Hi.
Hi, I'm super stoked to be here with you all. As Victoria said, I'm Anika Manzoor. I go by any pronouns, and I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of the Youth Activism Project. I'm going to try to do the short version of how I got involved in this work. And so I started off in activism as someone who had no idea what I was doing prior to becoming one of the founding members of the Youth Activism Project. I was very much what I say is that I was very much a dorky teenager, or preteen rather. I was 12 years old at the time. My life literally revolved around Harry Potter and Disney Channel and not doing my homework. Like, that was what my life was about. And I got an invitation to learn about an issue that I didn't know much about, but had somewhat of a connection due to where my family's from, which is the girls' education crisis in the global south, and the fact that in a lot of developing countries, girls aren't allowed to go to school because of their gender. And so I got involved in that issue, and that was the first issue that the Youth Activism Project advocated for. And throughout my adolescence, I had the opportunity to go to Capitol Hill and lobby for things like increased foreign aid for education. I was part of a groundswell of young people that actually passed a $200 million increase. And I was 16 at the time. And so um, all of those experiences were really what set me on this lifelong trajectory for civic leadership and civic change. And like I said, I was someone that, I was not like Greta Thunberg coming out of the womb with a picket sign. Like, I was very unremarkable and found someone who was able to nurture untapped potential. And here I am today.
That's amazing. No, that's such a cool story. And how did the organization spawn from that? Like, did you go straight into it? Did it evolve over time? What was that journey?
Yeah, so I always joke that I co-founded a 501(c)(3 without knowing what the hell that even meant. So in terms of like setting up the organization, I just didn't know, I didn't have to deal with that. I was just the face and, doing advocacy and stuff like that. And so um we started as a volunteer nonprofit in 2004, and we had been that way for a while. I would say our average budget was like $10,000 a year. And so in 2018, I started to look for funds to staff the nonprofit and scale it. And so we went from having a budget of about less than 40,000 in 2018 to now having a budget that's near 500,000. So we're growing. We're still kind of a small nonprofit, but we're getting there.
Yeah, I mean, that's the journey, right? I mean, that's how you do it. And that's so awesome. I love that. And yeah, just tell us more about what, kind of overview of what the organization is doing these days. And then we got a lot of questions, I think, that'll dig into some of the details and things people are curious about, but just kind of give us the lay of the land at first. What's the organization up to?
So the biggest area we work on is health equity, and our model is all about bringing young people that want to get involved in activism and don't know how to get started, and connect them to movements that really need their voices. And so in health equity, there are a lot of issues that disproportionately impact young people, and then the issues that we actually focus on are healthy hydration and teen tobacco use. And honestly, I mean, if you're to ask why do we even hone in on these specific issues, it's really where the funding is at, or where a lot of interest, public health interest is at, right? And so that's something to consider. But mental health is another issue that our young people consistently come to us and say, hey, we want to do more around this. We've done historically a lot of work on mental health, can't really do much right now, unfortunately. So that's one area. Another area is environmental justice. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but between these two policies, the government is making this massively historic investment in environmental justice efforts, specifically focused on communities of color and other disadvantaged communities. They're injecting a ton of money. They're in that process right now of giving organizations like GAP funds so that local governments can collaborate better with everyday people on environmental justice. And so we're super excited about that, and really kind of riding the coattails of that policy and making sure that money is going where it needs to go. And then hopefully, if all goes well in November, that we can persuade the administration to build on those kinds of investments, not just for health, but other issues. And then democracy reform is a newer area for us. We're kind of still in the development phase and just kind of chatting with folks such as yourself and really understanding the space a little bit more, but we are gearing up to do some exciting work with regards to ranked choice voting and ballot initiatives.
That's great. And it sounds like the core for young people and, high school, I believe, is the main kind of cohort here. It sounds like a lot of learning how to lobby, learning how to, try and push particular legislation, and get behind that. And then, direct funding and, what kind of comes after legislation, all the execution part, making sure that actually comes, to their community. Or is that a good summary, or what else would you add?
Yeah, we do. The way that I would like to, I typically like to talk about how we approach policy change is, I mean, we do a lot of work on actually passing policies, but we are trying to more move in the direction of protecting policies too, and making sure that they're not rolled back, because both of that work needs to happen at the same time.
That makes a lot of sense. That's super, super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to dive into some questions, unless you want to do any more level setting of what the organization is. I mean, what's the mission, by the way? What's the kind of the big picture, for what you're trying to do?
Yeah, we're just really trying to eliminate barriers to teen and youth civic engagement. And we're starting with these three issues, but our dream eventually is to be issue agnostic. I often like to say that we'd like to be like the Reddit of activism, like you can come to us and find a community specific to the type of issue you want to solve. So that's the long term goal. We're far away from that vision, but I think part of the problem is the fact that a lot of organizations do end up finding themselves focusing on specific issues, because I think the main problem is that I mean, there's lots of problems, but I think one of the biggest problems is philanthropy, and how there's just not enough philanthropic dollars for general civic engagement. So that's kind of the landscape we're up against, but it'll happen one day.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's very aligned with how Good Party exists too, of being issue agnostic, right? It's like we want to be that platform, and are, becoming that platform for candidates, to go and go change their communities and show up and do the good work. So yeah, that's amazing. So yeah, I think diving in, we have one at the gate here from local lizard lady who's on our Discord. Says, hi, Anika. I'm a community manager with ASU who works with newly admitted students, so teenagers still in high school. I believe building a supportive community is crucial for activism. Can you share how the Youth Activism Project helps young activists connect and support each other across the country, and what your best tips are for inspiring young people?
I love this question. I would say first and foremost, what we do is we root connection and community and storytelling. So when young people join us, the first thing we pretty much go over with them is helping them uncover their personal stories about like why they even came to the Youth Activism Project, what are their aspirations, and from there we're able to not only start seeding what I say is like the biggest superpower of an activist, which is knowing how to tell a good story. I always say storytelling is half of movement building, right? If you don't have the story nailed and you don't have the narrative nailed, it's so hard to do anything, right? And so not only are they building that crucial skill, but they're able to connect with each other and see in real time how this skill actually works. Like, and that's like my favorite part of doing this work. Like, I never get tired of hearing people's stories. Like, everyone always has something new to add to the movement, right? To this movement, the history of movement building that we've been doing for millennia at this point, right? And so that's how we start off. And then simply by providing a space for young people, like most of our offerings are virtual. We do some in-person programming, but the way to get people connected these days is definitely providing just that space for them to express their concerns. Like a lot of them come from conservative backgrounds, a lot of them are queer, and it's hard for them to be themselves in their communities. And so we provide respite and a place not just to heal, but also to learn skills to change your immediate environment. So that's a big part. We have a Slack. I mean, the Slack has not been that active. I've been like, I need to learn tips from y'all in terms of doing more Discord community building. I'm actually involved in Discords in my personal life, and it's really awesome how you're able to build connections. And Discord is just immensely more scalable than Slack. And so once we have capacity to really invest in that kind of like asynchronous, it's like asynchronous, synchronous. So it's kind of like a hybrid. So once we have capacity to really invest in that, I'm super excited to see how much more community building that can provide, because like managing online community is not easy. Like it, yeah. So that's one another tidbit. And then I would say like the biggest thing is really just to provide young people with the space where you're co-creating and not dictating what they're doing, right? And really treating them as equal partners. So whenever we have a young activist that joins our community, we don't think of them as beneficiaries. We think of them as partners. Like we are all fighting for our collective liberation. Like no one is here to serve someone else. Like we're here like building power so that we can all be liberated. So that's kind of the philosophy that we lead with.
Yeah, no, I resonate with that just personally. I was a young, like high school, I wasn't in the political activism space, but in my church community, I was a Unitarian at the time. They cut the funding for all of our national youth programming. And, I rallied, fellow high schoolers all over the country, to protest that at the big annual conference, and ended up drafting a resolution, because it's kind of a democratically run thing, and, speaking in front of 5,000 people at age 17, and that was because there were adults in my corner who treated me like a partner, like saw what I was, saw my like, frustration, and they were like, you can actually do something about that if you want to, right? Because on my own, I wouldn't have known, what the options were, like where I could have taken that. Like I had no idea about any of that. I just knew I had that, frustration that needed to go somewhere. And so, yeah, it's so much, having an adult at that time actually be like, look you in the eye and be like, no, you can do something, and I can give you the, support and guidance, but you also have the power to go do something yourself, So, yeah, I really resonate with what you said, Anika. It's very true.
I love that that's your history. Like whenever I hear from other folks in the movement space that they started in high school, because a lot of people start in college, like that's probably the most common age where folks get activated. But when I hear folks start in high school, I'm like, you get it.
Yeah, you're the young. I mean, it's wild when you're like, you're so, I mean, I remember being just the youngest person in the room, so many times over. And it's I think I think we're mostly going to be, there's a mix of people probably listening, mostly, I doubt, probably past high school, college and older. But I think, it's just remembering like what it was like, right? To, when each of us were in high school, or for you are in high school listening, what it is like to feel like, okay, like I have a lot I want to, I want to experience and do, and I want to figure this out. But like you have to be kind of met, right. In not, there's not the right way to do it, but in a way that is empowering ultimately. Yeah, that's great. James, I see you have a hand. If you don't mind putting your question in the chat, we have a live stream going, so we can't easily configure other people into it, but please put your question in the chat so I can ask it. Thank you. Really happy you're here. One other kind of quick follow-up for you, Anika, is, you mentioned storytelling as being a core skill, that you're teaching and building with folks. Can you just say a little bit more too about, I imagine there's like a dimension of personal storytelling, and then also storytelling around whatever the issue is that, someone's working on. So would just be curious to hear a little bit more about, the way that you, approach that, since that's probably relevant for everyone here to hear your wisdom on.
Yeah, no, you're really teeing me up with these questions. So the main sort of storytelling framework that we use and that we train our youth organizers on is called the public narrative framework. And that's been created by Marshall Gans, who's over at the Harvard Kennedy School. That's where I went for grad school. And I took all of Marshall's public narrative and organizing classes. Really draw a lot from his incredible brilliance. And so his public narrative framework is essentially the way that I describe it is interrelated stories. And there's three stories that are woven together. One is story of self, which is one's personal story. And then another aspect is the story of now, which is, to your point, Victoria, like how do you talk about the issue? And sometimes people talk about the issue in the story of self. They have personal experience with the issue that they're fighting for. But most times you talk about the issue in the story of now, which is essentially the call to action, right? It's a description of what exactly is the problem, how bad is it, how bad it's going to get if no one acts, and here's the pathway to making things better if you do act, and here's how you need to act, right? So it just really breaks that down. And then there's the story of us, which is the story that most people really struggle with, because people often don't think about storytelling or think about activism in this way, but it's story of us is the story of your community. Like, how is your community already banded together to take action against issues? And then using that as an example to say, hey, we've already done this. Now I'm asking you to take a step further. And then once, people put it together and they start seeing how it applies to their lives, it's such a powerful experience. I have youth activists in college now that still use that framework to this day when it comes to like writing applications and also continuing their organizing. And so that's really the sort of pedagogical approach we take to storytelling.
That's great. Yeah, it's such a life skill. Like it's like not, it's obviously useful for, this work, but it's just especially, I mean, I can't, I've learned public narrative since, but I can't imagine how helpful that would have been to me in high school. Like, geez,
Exactly.
like, I wish someone had taught me that then.
And what's really great about teaching it to high schoolers is because so much of it is, what's your activism origin story, or like what's your activist superhero origin story? Like I also always like to like compare it to, popular media like Marvel comics and stuff like that, so that people can see themselves as superheroes, right? Because more people need to be like that in this world, actually. And when you're living in your origin story, it's so much easier to articulate than if you're like 20 years out like me. And yeah.
100%. Yeah. And I'd say just for everyone, on listening, watching, it's like, you're someone who cares clearly, about our democracy. Otherwise you wouldn't be tuned into this. So, just think about that for yourselves, right? Like what's your, your superhero just for caring, honestly, right? Given how, and it's up to us to try to bring more people in to just, even tiptoe in and care a little bit more. But So just consider that for yourselves, everyone listening, because
Yeah, let me put a fine point on that because I'm sure people are listening might feel like, oh, my story's not great. Oh, like just talking yourself down. No, everyone's story is amazing. And I say that I literally, like, I am someone, I'm very honest. I do not BS people. Like every time I do public narrative work with someone, and I kind of dig deep with because there's also like a practice of like asking the right questions too. That's a part of it. And folks will start out with like very little detail. And then once I really ask them questions, they realize like, oh, wow, my story is actually super powerful. So if you think your story is not worth it, like get that thought out of your head.
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy for a high schooler to feel that way because they're like, well, I haven't done a lot yet. I've been going to school and I've been, right? And so if someone who may feel that way in high school can find their story and be able to tell it, like for those of you listening who have, even more life experience, there's a story there for sure, so that's amazing. And I'll just shout out, it looks like James in the on the Zoom here runs the National Student Mock Election. So there's a potential connect there. So that's awesome. And we have a question from Ryan here. So in your experience, what is the most effective way for young advocates to organize toward policy changes? Like specifically, what forms of activism do you find most successful for activists whose political capabilities are limited by age? And I assume that's, can't run for office when you're in high school typically, right? So you're limited there. But yeah, what would you kind of point people toward or say has been the most effective strategies?
I mean, I think one thing to remember is that even though people under the age of 18 can't necessarily vote, that doesn't mean that their elected officials don't work for them and don't answer to them, right? So definitely like we teach young people how to be taken seriously by adults. Like we give them templates on how to write emails to elected officials. We guide them on, these are ways in which you might want to consider positioning yourself so that you're taken seriously, right? Like these are things you don't want to say because they're going to dismiss it as like a school project. This is the type of language that you want to use, right? Plugging young people into intergenerational or adult-led coalitions has been a really effective move, I would say. Specifically having young people advocate for issues that impact them, because there are, I think the most savvy advocates, especially when it comes to like the public health space, they understand the importance of, so much of public health is about awareness and prevention. And so if you're able to inculcate good habits early on, that obviously sets society up to be healthier, right? And so a lot of advocates actually do realize that young people are really necessary for driving forward systemic change. And so finding those allies, it's really not that hard to find, right? It may feel like it is because a lot of adults, and I even fall prey to it myself, in terms of like what we call adultism, which is oppression against young people, right? Like now that I'm on the other side as an adult, it's, and sometimes I like have to do that deep reflection myself and say, oh, wow, I'm perpetuating the problem that, I used to complain about as a young person. And um, so there's like, an awareness about that and just and creating those safe spaces for young people, I would say is a big thing.
Can I double click on that for a
Oh
second?
yeah, go ahead.
Since probably a fair number of adults listening, what would you say are like those signals of your falling into adultism, things that like just be self-aware of like, oh yeah, I said I did this or I said that this way, like what are those, how would you kind of call out what those
Yeah.
things are?
I would say for me, like one of the things that I really had to struggle with is being really directive with my suggestions, right? And so I had to do a lot of practice and kind of like asking. And this is like if you're an adult who like manages people, for example, like this is also really good practice to manage people, right? Like ask folks like, okay, what do you think? How do you think about going this way? Or how do you think about going about this issue? And then adding your 2 cents after they share it, right? I think like being mindful about like whether or not you're tokenizing young people, right? Like, are you just inviting them to, you know, an event just because their faces make you look good and they're just there for a photo op and nothing else? Like, do they have you know, opportunities to engage meaningfully with decision making? There are like lots of tools available. One is called the Heart's Ladder of Engagement, which talks about like different levels of like ways to engage young people and examples. Our a plug for our co-founder Wendy Lesko. She's not at YAP anymore, but she's still doing a lot of youth advocacy or work related to dismantling the power dynamics between young people and adults. And so she has this great book called Why Aren't We Doing This? And I can drop the link in the chat at some point, but it's basically how can organizations create structures to make sure that young people are engaged in an intergenerational manner in a way that like yeah, and I think another thing that would be useful for adults, or a framing that would be useful for adults who work with young people or want to work with young people, is that you know, I often see like, even though there's always going to be a power dynamic, both parties do bring unique strengths to the movement. And so, and it's hard, you can't really say one is better than the other. So adults really bring the gift of seeing the world as it is and kind of being realistic. But the downside of that is that you can, you know, I see some nods here, like you can really fall into the trap of like feeling jaded and, you know, not expanding the possibilities of oh, thanks Victoria for dropping that in the chat. Yeah, and so not really expanding like what the possibilities are, right, for our liberation. Whereas like young people, you know, they're not mired into the world, and sometimes maybe some of their aspirations and plans can be a bit pie in the sky, but they also, I argue, have a better sense of justice, have a better capacity to envision what a world should look like. And so you really need that. It's a fully balancing act. And so I think, you know, really believing that kind of philosophy and leading from that really sets you up for, you know, being reflexive when you're working with young people, and like making sure that you're constantly asking like, okay, like, you know, I think that one thing that I did might have felt a little, you know, yeah, like tokenizing, or they maybe they didn't feel heard, or and then, you know, you ask them, hey, did how did you feel about this interaction, and provide that kind of trust and that safe space. And, you know, when you build that trust, young people are going to be really, really honest with you. So it's really like being an ally to any movement where you know, you don't have lived experience regarding the causes that you're fighting for, right? And so it's just a matter of seeding it in trust-filled relationships and knowing that that takes time, and also allowing yourself grace for when you mess up too.
Yeah, no, that's all such good advice. It's so true. And I feel like often it's just all, I think the other piece I would just add, you know, thinking back to my own lived experience back then and then now, it's like often it's just like taking another pause, like giving a little more space, giving a little more time, because I feel like it's so, you know, so common when you're having a conversation and you're like, well, what do you think we should do? And I feel like often someone at that age will be like, well, I don't know. And then if you then jump and say, well, okay, you don't know, so da 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 da, we can do this. Like, it's like, well, I asked, but then I jumped to the, you know, my solution. So it's like, you gotta tease, you gotta give it space and tease it out more than you're used to doing with an adult. So yeah, that would be fun.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then amazing things will happen. You're like, whoa, you know, I mean, I've had those moments where I'm like, wow, I'm glad I let this conversation play out because I'm now blown away, right? So
Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah, we have some more questions here. A question from Garrett. Any advice on breaking up political apathy in young people? In my life, I see those who essentially ignore politics because they may be uncomfortable with potential disagreements, or those who are very politically opinionated but lack a belief in the power of their vote. So yeah, what's your advice?
Oh my God.
Deep well.
Yeah. Where do I even get started with that? I mean, I'm still obviously clearly I'm still trying to figure that out myself. Especially the whole, I'm always someone who's advocating for voting, like no matter what. Yes, it sucks that the system is you know, rigged to the extent that we're constantly voting for the lesser of two evils. Like, and I'm someone, I'll be really honest, I'm someone who's pro-Palestine, for example, and I definitely understand. I have also I'm pro-Palestine, but I also, in terms of like tactically what's happening, I have issues with both sides, of course. And so I think one of the challenges with this is just how everyone seems to be operating from a trauma response. And so, and I feel like no one's having that conversation, right? So, um, I, yeah, so I went on that tangent real quick, because I wanted to make the point of like, I see a lot of people not voting for Biden, no vote of confidence for Biden. And as an advocate working on lots of different issues and working on issues that wouldn't be an issue if, we didn't have Trump in office, because he rolled back. For example, he rolled back on Obama era child nutrition safety standards so that the food industry can just pump children with sodium and a lot of unhealthy things. And so we had to do work of bringing that back up, right? So like there, and then I mentioned like the funding that that's around with the IRA and the IIJA, like all of that's going to be gone. And also Trump is going to be worse um for what's happening in the Middle East anyway. So it's like I do not understand. I really like it just this turned into a little bit of a rant, but I honestly do not understand that mentality. I think the way I get it, I kind of get it, but I'm just also like I think it's just a matter of just brave people willing to have those conversations and having it in a way that's not about like ideological superiority or like my way or the highway. I mean, I think this kind of goes back to this tactic question I wanted to answer. I wanted to share this answer earlier, but it slipped my mind. But I think one really underrated tactic is, especially in this day and age where there's so much polarization everywhere, not just between two sides of the political spectrum, but within like the left and the right. Um, and the way to address polarization is through unity. It's not through, a lot of movement tactics, for example, like force people to pick a side, which has a time and place, right? Like I'm never gonna downplay that. And that's all related to, rich tradition of like direct action and a lot of amazing outside strategies, right? But we also need to popularize bridge building and having difficult conversations and modeling difficult conversations. So the person who asked the question was talking about how like people are apathetic because because they don't want to get into uncomfortable conversations. But the way to do that is for those of us that are brave and that are able to have those uncomfortable conversations, lead the way and model and show examples of how to have these conversations without being triggered, how to end up in a place at least to say, I don't agree with you, but I see where you're coming from. And maybe from that position, you can kind of find win-win solutions, right? So I really, yeah, I think my summary of that is if you're someone who is not apathetic, like use these tools to your advantage, make spaces as safe as possible for people to engage, because people want to engage, right? They need hand holding. And so that's my biggest advice. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to kind of take it down a level too. I mean, I think we struggle with this just in our organization because we're not playing on the presidential level at all. You know, we're staying agnostic there and focusing our energy on local and state, you know, because that's where, you know, we really see huge potential this year, and we're already seeing, you know, candidates coming on and, you know, willing to jump in with us, which is super duper exciting. And so I'd be curious to kind of take Garrett's question to the like, what have you seen, like what's worked, or, you know, what kind of approaches have worked around getting younger folks interested in local politics, state level politics, because all the oxygen gets sucked up by presidential politics and Congress and all this stuff that's important, but for like someone in high school, really hard to imagine how am I gonna make a dent in that, right? I mean, so how do you have you approached that from like, you know, the local and state, or where do you kind of start people's journey if they're like apathetic? Like I imagine the first step isn't from apathy to go do something national, you know, right? So I'm curious your advice there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the same tactics I feel like work on the local level. And I think they work even better because I mean, even better or worse, you know, depending on like how these strategies are levied, because you're in community with these people, and these issues tend to be really tend to really cut people to their core. So and then I also have just been seeing a great trend of more and more um adults inviting young people to like co-lead their campaign, and things like that. So I feel like building, building on that trend is also yeah, really useful. But yeah, I mean, I think polarization is just, it's at every corner of our society. And so the way to really address that is, like I said, to be brave and to model what it's like to have civil conversations, civil debates. That way you can hopefully scale that across your community.
Yep, I love that. And Daniel asked, what are some of the biggest challenges that teen activists face today? And, you know, how does YAP help them navigate these challenges? So I'd be curious to hear about both. But yeah, what's like, bring us
Yeah.
into the what it's like to be, you know, in high school and engaging in activism
Yeah.
right now.
I mean, I will preface this answer by saying that I personally am not in high school, and I'm very far removed from high school. So, my answer really should be taken with a grain of salt. Like, I wish I was here with one of my youth activists so that they can speak directly from their experiences. But from what I have seen is that, and this I think has always been the case for young people and students, but it seems particularly pronounced now. But young people are really dealing with a lot. And it's so much harder to get into college, for example, than when I was applying. I was also nearly 20 years ago at this point. Wow, I'm really dating myself. But and, you know, like, for example, I grew up in Maryland, and University of Maryland was the school where pretty much everyone went to, and it was relatively easy to get into. And if you had like, you know, a good GPA and what have you. And I see um my cousins, for example, applying to UMD and having, you know, similar grades that I did back in the day, not getting in. Right. And so I think I mean, of course, not all young people are college bound, but I think what's happening with colleges in general is like uh there is like a market increase in like competitiveness, I think, amongst younger generations. So, you know, whether it's college or whether, you know, a lot of young people want to be influencers, for example. And that kind of like constant exposure to like hustle culture, right? Or like people want to make a name for themselves. How do you do it? You get in that hustle pipeline, right? Like I think that's just pervasive in terms of what I see with young people. And so yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of like talking about rest and talking about how not to get caught up in this capitalist system. And I think, another thing that I've been seeing is increased social anxiety. And so wait, let me close out my last. Sorry, I have ADHD, so I'm like all over the place all the time. But like to close out my last point, young people are balancing so much. We often see that impeding their activism aspirations, right? So like folks will come to us and say, I want to be an activist. And we tell them, okay, great. This is how you be an activist. Like this, if you want to be an effective activist, you got to like know how to recruit people. You got to know how to like manage relationships, yada, yada, yada. And once they see that, they're like, yeah, no, never mind. No, thanks. And it's such a sad thing, right? And so um, I think we're taking like slower approaches to cultivating young activists, right? Like meeting them where they're at. I mentioned earlier, when I do my public narrative work, I relate it a lot to like popular media. That's an area that we're really trying to explore further, so that we can start with something that feels easy, right? Like talking about social justice themes in a book feels a lot more easier and a lot more tangible and something that people can make time for, versus like talking about in real life. But you're still building skills that could ultimately be leveraged for later. So like we're trying to figure out, how do we use that as a way to build quote unquote like latent organizing capacity. So like that, at one point you'll have people that are like activated that you can tap into, and once the time is right, they could plug in, right? So that's something that we're building to kind of address that issue. And the other thing I was going to say was the social anxiety piece, which, also when I remember being a young person, and I did a lot of, I don't know what the exact term is, but when you stand on a street corner and try to get people to sign
Canvassing,
sign up
yeah.
for Habitat. Sorry, go ahead, Victoria.
Canvassing, yeah.
Just yeah, like, I guess canvassing, right? Like just plain old canvassing. Um, and I guess in our case it was like, yeah, anyway, but yes, canvassing. So I did a lot of canvassing as a young person, and that stuff is hard to do, like for someone of any age, not just a young person. And so and to ask we don't really engage in much canvassing right now for advocacy, but to asking people to do that, like these days with how, they don't even like to talk to each other on the phone, right? Which, I mean, a lot of millennials don't even like, I like talking on the phone. I've always liked talking on the phone ever since I was a young person. It's weird to me how a lot of millennials grew up doing that. And then like, I guess with like texting, like if you see that shift in millennials, then of course, Gen Z who never grew up talking on, I guess a lot of them do FaceTime, right? But still, it's like when your main mode of communication is texting, how are you going to expect people to do relational organizing? Which is really like nothing is ever going to replace relational organizing. Like everyone needs to learn that.
What is it for folks who don't know what it
Oh,
is? Just a quick definition. Yeah.
yeah. So relational organizing is essentially this idea of, build like producing social change through your relationships and getting people into the movement through one-on-one relationships, right? That's the best way to do it. You can do that through text, but it's not nearly as effective as if you have one-on-one conversations, meet up and get to know someone that way, right? And so that's like after the storytelling, like we teach storytelling so that young people can be well versed in relational organizing. And if they're not able to do that because of social anxiety, then it's like, we're not winning, right? So that's a nut that we're really trying to figure out how to crack. That one's a particularly hard nut to crack. But I would say those are like the top two issues, like not having time and social anxiety.
Yeah, that's super fascinating and it makes total sense to me. Absolutely. Yeah, that's good. And I think, kind of this is an interesting question. I'm going to frame it kind of in both directions, because there's obviously like the adult perspective, and then there's the like being, the high school or perspective, and perhaps you have advice for both. But Sam in Theory on our Discord asked, maybe it's not, this isn't your wheelhouse, but when I've been speaking with my friends who are parents, I noticed them writing off a lot of their kids' interests as frivolous, but I don't see them working to engage other avenues of political awakening. Do you have any recommendations on how to get those conversations started? I guess what I'm looking for are tips for conversations with parents of teens not currently engaging with the political process. So that'd be like one angle. And the other angle would be like, well, what if you are that homeschooler, right? Like how do you, what any advice do you have there?
Well, if you are a high schooler, we have communities like Youth Activism Project that you can join. We're a safe space for you guys to explore your activist interests, as long as it's under like the social justice umbrella. And so that's my advice to young people. Like that space, if your parents aren't supportive, there are online spaces that you can join. Future Coalition is another really great organization that honestly has more capacity than we do. So they might be a good organization to plug into. So there's like lots of different organizations actually. And in terms of being like in the middle of like parents and young people, I mean, I will be honest, I am a little bit nervous to even share advice in this area because on one hand, you don't want to be seen as meddlesome, but on the other hand, like it, and I've been there. I've been in exactly, who is the person who asked this question? What was their name?
Sam in Theory is their handle, but
Sam,
yes.
Sam in Theory, like I have been there. It is so hard to see a young person have aspirations and their parents like shoot them down. I mean, if you have like a good relationship, I'm very meddlesome. So for better or for worse. So I will call people out and I will assess it. Like if I have a relationship with someone where we do call each other out, like it's easier to do that. So maybe there are gentle ways to be like, hey, so I noticed like, with little Jimmy, you're not really encouraging his comic interest. I mean, I'm guessing it was like any interest, not just activism, right? And so, and then if your friend gets mad at you, then you're like, okay, not doing that again, right? But I do think it's worth broaching the subject if you feel like you have a good relationship and you have a history of like kind of being real with each other. And I'm wondering if there's ways you could, like a lot of times I'll have parents in my family or other parents that I know like who are children of adolescents or who are parents of adolescents. They'll complain about not being able to connect to their kids or something like that. And so if that's the case, I mean, that could be like an opening to maybe like ask questions, right? And try to get them to get to the right answer. Or you can say, oh, I'd love to, like, would you be interested in if I would, mentor your kid, right? And then kind of be a supportive presence that way. Those are just different tactics. I mean, it's always, I think, a really dicey issue when it comes to seeing like people that you're close with who are parents like not support their kids, because no one wants to look like you're criticizing their parenting. But I think people just need to try things and share stories and share their experiences. And like I said, I think for me, like I'm a massive like Harry Potter fan, which is really like crazy as a trans person. But it's something I am negotiating with. And actually, just side note, in a community of Harry Potter trans fans who are transing all of the characters through like fan art and stuff like that. So that's also like I can go in that rabbit hole of like what that means in terms of like lessons about resistance and stuff like that. But I'm going on this Harry Potter tangent to say I'm in my Gryffindor era now. I like identify with all the houses, but Gryffindor is like the one thing that I'm putting that it just keeps coming back in my life, like the importance of just being brave. like the importance of stepping out of your comfort zone and the importance of possibly even risking relationships, like if you feel like there's something you need to say, like, of course, think about it, right? Of course, like, don't do what I often do, which is impulsively open my mouth and regret it later, right? Like, really think about it. But I do think people need to be a little bit more braver to broach topics that they don't want to broach because they don't want to ruin relationships, to be honest. And so if there's one theme that folks are like taking away from my talk today is just being brave. And I think what makes it easier to be brave is if you find a buddy who's like trying to do the same things that you're trying to do as well, and you can hold each other accountable. Because I know it's easier said than done. But yeah, I hope that's helpful. That was a really tough question. It is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I felt like it merited an answer.
No, it's tough. Yeah, a couple things I would just throw in, also just it's a hard one. I think even if they might maybe say it in a way that the person does react, you're planting a seed, right? So in that moment they might be like, don't say that, like feel like they're being criticized and kind of lash back, but like they'll probably be thinking about it later, right? And the other thing too I've found is like I know my parents at least were like so grateful when there were other adults in my life willing to mentor me, because it's hard to be a parent. It's exhausting. So I think, if you kind of express it that way of like, hey, like it would be cool for me, honestly, just to have, the teenager in my life and someone who I can build that kind of relationship with. Is that cool with you? I'll like ease into it. Can't make it weird, but like, there's a way to kind of start that relationship with them directly so that it's not like trying to like side parent or like, like backseat drive, kind of thing. Right. And you can cultivate that. And then the last thing I'd say too, when I think about like my upbringing, I grew up Mormon. I grew up in like a very, I'd say very, service oriented religion, essentially, right? Like there's a lot of, volunteering and service kind of orientation. And the good thing about that is like from a young age, I was like volunteering in homeless shelters with my family because my family would go and do that, right? And so if someone's like not politically, like a teenager's not politically interested, that might be like too far. I think just taking an easy step of like, as a family, we're going to go volunteer at the local homeless shelter and serve meals for a night. And it's just like, it's hard to say no to that. You're gonna be like, no, I don't want to go out, right? Like that's a tough one to turn down or kind of try to get out of because it is so fundamental and important. And that might be like the door cracks open, kind of moment of like, oh, I can do this kind of activist or nonprofit or giving work. Maybe political won't be the thing they get excited about. Maybe it'll be something totally different, but it's, something in that era. So that's the kind of stuff that comes up for me.
I appreciate that, Victoria. I feel like you really wrapped that up and articulate that way better than I could have. So I appreciate that.
Oh yeah, no, I've lived it too. So we both, it's interesting. I mean, you're more the expert here for sure, but and then related, actually interesting. So Sam's 15-year-old nibbling, we just got a question coming in, through them, no name, so don't have a name there, but what have your most successful campaigns been and how do you measure that success? What strategies do you use to attract youth to the program? And can you share an inspiring story about someone participating in one of your programs?
Yeah, so most successful campaign. I mean, it's so hard because, we had victories at all levels of government. So maybe I could kind of highlight a couple. I would say one of my proudest policy wins that I saw, and I didn't want to say it's my victory. These are all like our youth activists. It's their victory. And so there was a group called Students Toward Equitable Public Schools, and they are based in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is where the Youth Activism Project is headquartered in. And they started off doing a lot of local advocacy around trying to get our boundaries, our school boundaries, a little bit more equitable. I mean, essentially, the way that a lot of school boundaries and school districts are drawn is kind of like gerrymandering, basically. And it's a way to, keep resources hoarded in wealthier communities, even though public education is meant to be the same for everyone. And so So they started fighting on that issue. That issue, like the fight on that issue fizzled, but because there was so much energy for that issue, they were able to translate it into other causes. And so at the same time when they were founded, there was also educational equity legislation that was being deliberated at the state level. And it actually passed the House and the Senate, but it was vetoed by the governor. And so our youth involved with Students for Public, what am I, why I'm like messing up different names. Students Toward Equitable Public Schools. Thank you. So or STEPS for short, I'm just gonna call it STEPS. So students with STEPS, they, because they had so much experience doing coalition building for the local issues that they're working out, and they had a dynamite youth leader who I'm gonna talk about in terms of like the inspiring story, who really just like took my mentorship and took the lessons that we provided and just ran with it. And it just was this incredibly exceptional, like one of the most effective organizers I've ever seen in my life. She was also, when I mentioned young people who like managed campaigns, she was a campaign co-manager at the age 19 for a local campaign of like the front runner. So so through under Avery's leadership, they, alongside youth all across the state of Maryland, lobbied, not lobbied, but like wrote letters to their elected officials and contacted their elected officials saying like, you guys need to vote to override this veto. And they did that. And now, and we're still trying to figure out how to fund the policy, but the fact remains that it's there, and there's more political will to actually make good promise on that. And so, and quickly on Avery's story, Avery was a student, was always a really good student, wasn't super involved in student government, which was also kind of similar to my experience, because you often see the student government to activism pipeline. But meeting Avery was perfect because she was not in that pipeline. She was not kind of overcommitted to leadership activities. She was an athlete, and just a really incredibly bright person who had time. So it was like she was smart, she had the time, and she had the passion for the issue. So that's like the trifecta that I always look for when I recruit leaders so she was our first paid organizer, or one of our first paid organizers at least. And so from there, and that was her first experience doing advocacy, and really kind of developing that leadership. Now she's a full ride scholar at Duke University, and is constantly talking about how the experiences that she had with the Youth Activism Project was what enabled her to to get that scholarship and to continue fighting for change. So that's Avery's story. I'd love to share maybe a story of Lauren Proby, who is an incredible disability justice advocate, who also fights for disability justice at the intersection of Black girlhood, really taking like a really important intersectional lens to it. Lauren came to the Youth Activism Project when she was either a sophomore or junior in high school, and was not getting the supports in her school because of her disabilities, and they didn't even know what her proper disabilities was until she got an autism diagnosis. And so through the Youth Activism Project, she found a community where people didn't infantilize her, and wasn't, I'm sure she had to deal with ableism because ableism is everywhere, but I would imagine it's significantly less ableist than other other spaces. And to go from someone who like was just so looked down upon to where she is now, which is like getting so many like awards for her activism. And she's also a full ride scholar as well. And her dream, I think, is to end up at the White House, which I absolutely 100% believe is going to happen. Not necessarily in the presidency, but in their like disability justice office. Although I definitely think the world would be a better place if Lauren Proby was president. And I also owe her a great amount of of gratitude for helping me understand that I was neurodivergent, and just learning more about mental health and kind of like the cutting edge of mental health understandings of mental health. For example, I don't know if folks know what maladaptive daydreaming is, but okay, yeah, so it seems like a new term. Like she was doing like a social media project, like Yap was mentoring her to do a social media project to raise awareness about various mental health issues, and one of which was maladaptive daydreaming, which is something that I did, and I did not have a vocabulary for it. But it's basically where you spend hours daydreaming because of various different reasons. And so I learned, I mean, that's just one example of the many things that I learned from Lauren. And I really, you know, what I love about this role is it really is like an equal experience. And I think like my relationship with Lauren really is like the epitome of how much I truly feel that equality, you know? And I really look at her as kind of my comrade in arms when it comes to like the first person I'm going to scheme with about disability justice and about building the disability justice movement is Lauren. And I have adult friends that are in the disability justice field. I go straight to Lauren. And so yeah, it's just such a blessing to like start as a young person. And I'm like trying not to cry right now because I'm like, it's just this ripple effect of just ongoing, like, these kids are so much better than I could have ever been as a young activist. And then I know like the next generation is going to be even crazier. So when it comes to like the apathy question, I think that's something to remember, right? Like we have people that are out here fighting the good fight and they need you. If you're not really in the fight yet, like we need you so badly. And then, you know, and then you, because like Avery and Lauren, both of them, they've inspired, like, I would say between the two of them, they've inspired hundreds of others to care more about these issues. And those hundreds of others are going to inspire hundreds of others, right? And so that's what people need to remember. Like sometimes it's hard to see the long-term vision of what movement building can look like when you're just one person. But I hope this story kind of elucidates that, you know, this is actually how it works.
Yeah, that is so well said and beautiful. And it is like the wheel turns in this amazing way. You know, it's just like, and then it picks up and yeah, it's just incredible. And I'm curious too, if you have any thoughts or maybe a story too about, you know, kind of that like maybe someone who wasn't coming in the door like primed and ready, you know, right? But someone who was like, maybe more like, you know, like, I mean, you kind of said that about yourself almost. You're like, well, I wasn't, you know, no one maybe would have thought I would be that. And I ended up being this, you know, activist. But, and like in that, I'd be curious to hear too about like, what does the light bulb moment look like, you know, for someone who maybe it's the light bulb's off to begin with, right? And it turns on of like, oh, wait, I can do something. And that agency is developed. Like, what does that process look like? And do you have a story to share?
Yeah, I'm not gonna name this person because I actually haven't like asked for permission to share her story, but I think it's fine if I just talk about her in general terms. So there's this one activist that we worked with who came to us, and she's like, you know, her she just seems really shy, right? When you meet her. And actually she didn't come to us. We were doing community engagement sessions on this issue, which is a public health issue, and I'm keeping it intentionally vague. But she was definitely, she was an aspiring leader, so I will say that. And she was in a leadership program that we spoke to, but I think she was, you know, still kind of coming into her leadership, and she was really shy and didn't have a lot of confidence when it came to public speaking. But after working with us for several months, like she had recruited so many of her friends to join our effort, even though she was so nervous about it in the beginning. And then her friends, so this is back to my like whole example of like the ripple effect. Like her friends, a lot of them also, that was their first for, because we were working in a very disadvantaged community. So for a lot of them, that was their first foray into activism. And a lot of them, you know, like came into the space, like, you know, like all of them came into the space really shy. And then as things developed, you know, you see, oh, this person wasn't really that shy to begin with. And it makes so much sense how they've taken so much leadership here. But then there was another girl that was recruited as part of that whole ripple effect, who was similar to that initial girl that I was talking about, like lacked a lot of confidence and was really quiet and really shy. And her personality wasn't that like, oh, I'm going to be quiet right now and then I'm going to show my true colors later. No, it was consistently that. But then, you know, I remember that she was leading one of our presentations to a funder who it wasn't specifically to a funder, but a funder was in that crowd. And just to see with how much confidence she was able to talk about the public health issue, and how she shared her own personal story and like the growth that she made from that initial shy girl, was just absolutely astounding to see.
That's amazing. And I think you're speaking actually to an interesting dynamic, one to just be aware of if you're an adult or if you're, you know, a teenager. But I feel like often when the adult enters the room, the social dynamics can shift in this interesting way. And it's like the person, you know, the teen, you know, who's like actually very animated with, you know, their friends kind of shuts down a little bit or quiets down. And so back to, I think, what you were saying earlier about trust building and all these things are really important, because you might be reading someone completely wrong just because those dynamics kind of, you know, alter someone the way they're showing up. So yeah, I'm curious if you have anything to add to that, but I've definitely seen that for sure.
No, I think again, Victoria, you're just so good at like sort of tying things up really well. And I think that's exactly that's what I was trying to get at. And I think it's something that adults need to remember. I think it goes back to what I was saying about like allowing space and time for trust. There's a quote actually that I'm trying to get it right. I might just paraphrase it, but it's I think it's like social change moves at the pace of relationships and relationships moves at the pace of trust, right? So whenever I'm trying to like force something to happen, I always have to remember that and go back to that.
Yeah, it's like, oh, where are the relationships? Where's the trust? I want to forge ahead, but I got to slow myself down and, you know, yeah, be at the pace of where things are. Totally. No, I get that. And then, you know, Sam asked another question actually, looking ahead, you know, just curious to hear what the evolving will look like for Youth Activism Project in the next few years. You talked about like the long-term vision, but yeah, what's the kind of nearish term, you know, vision for how this evolves?
Yeah, I would say, you know, one of the things that I'll just focus on one thing. There's lots of things we have kind of in the works, but I think the one thing that I'm truly really excited for is attacking industry, and specifically the tobacco industry and the beverage industry that we're kind of focusing on with our public health work. Um, and yeah, and the reason for that is it, you know, we're in coalition with lots of really cool organizations and organizations that have better standing than YAP and a stronger standing than YAP. Um, and we're such a kind of motley crew, right? Like we're approaching the issue from different angles. So I feel like we have all the pieces, but it's just a matter of like being super strategic, and uh and being fearless, right? Because these issues that we're tackling from the public health perspective, people are scared. They're scared to touch these issues. A lot of times it's because they're funded by the people we're trying to take down, right? And we see this all the time. So I'm really excited to bring in young people into this kind of burgeoning, I mean, the tobacco stuff, it's been going on for a while, but what we have seen, we've just got involved in that work. What we've seen is that the tobacco movement does not know how to engage young people. And they're not really that familiar with, you know, kind of like the apathy question. Like you see that a lot with like young people who vape, for example, who like there's like a small fraction who vape and realize that they shouldn't, and there's this other fraction that just doesn't care. and they roast you if you try to like, and so like the tactics that the tobacco movement is using is just not helping. And so we're really excited to kind of get in that fight and sort of be that movement builder amongst young people, because they need young people in order to win that movement. And with the healthy hydration stuff, I mean, it's this like same playbook, and so many industries use the same playbook of marketing their products as like these cool lifestyle things, and specifically preying on communities of color and low-income communities. And so I'm excited to, you know, figure out how to try to take them down from these two issues, and then seeing how we could maybe use that to take down other industries as well. But that's what's really driving my work lately. I mean, there's a lot of like I'm super excited about a lot of democracy reform stuff. That's still in the early stages though. Like we were really hitting the ground running with our counter marketing work, and I'm so excited to get young people involved in that, because I know they're going to be so fearless and like really hitting the beverage and the tobacco industries where they hurt. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. That's really interesting work. And then, the democracy reform angle, there's so much potential. I mean, I know I'm I'm COO of Good Party, but, volunteer for Fair Vote Illinois, which is ranked choice voting, across Illinois and Chicago. And we have some amazing high school organizers, because we have petitions and, ballot initiatives we're running in 3 kind of suburb communities around Chicago. And I think all of them at this point have a high school organizer who's just critical, to getting that going and off the ground. And so it's like just, finding those folks who are like, it's such a tangible thing, right, that folks are doing, and really important work. And for folks, who are part of the Good Party world, obviously, we're all on the page around the 2-party system being a challenge, and, this kind of ballot initiative work, like ranked choice voting and other, pieces of the puzzle really are huge unlocks and help for us to elevate our candidates even further. So yeah, that's it's just awesome to see.
I love that. I had no idea that RCV Illinois actively were engaging high school students, because when I've been talking to folks in the in the RCV electoral democracy reform space, like I got a lot of like, what about like young voters? And I'm like, yes, young voters too, but we cannot be sleeping on future voters. So it seemed like, like it seems like RCV Illinois is kind of at the cutting edge of how to engage community, from my opinion. No shade on the other RCV movements that are, but
I think it sounds like, I mean, what you're doing is so important though, because when you're in an adult only essentially organization that's doing whatever it could be, and it could be an issue based work, it could be political, more straight up political work, etc. There is a competency building, and a lot of adults are just like, oh, like, I don't know how to even start. And then maybe a high schooler does at some point kind of like show up or kind of get sort of interested, and then they kind of flub it. And then they all go, well, they didn't care anyway. And they graduated and they're gone. And, it kind of reinforces this like cycle of like, I think it's a lot of just people don't know what to do. And so they don't do it. So I love what you were doing, because you're like equipping, the young person for how to build these skills and to contribute. And obviously, I think on the organization side, we have to do our part too, to actually, learn the skills of showing up for younger people and cultivating their leadership, because that's what this is in the long game. That's what we have to do,
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really important work. And this actually connects to Katrina's question of, what is the best way for an adult to get involved who sees this AMA? Like, what would you say to the adults witnessing this? Great conversation.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and drop my email if folks do want to engage, because what we're really trying to do is and I'll say, like, I'll drop my email, but I will most likely redirect you to someone else. So just note that my email gets really clogged, and
since it's
your
being
best
live streamed, do you want it out on the live stream too, or do you want to keep it on the Zoom?
You know what we should do? I'm just gonna put our info email, and you can go ahead, you can put that out. Just go ahead, respond to the info email, and then my assistant we'll be able to deal with that and redirect you to the right people, or at least we can start building. I think what we want to do is build a list of adults that can be engaged in our summer programming. And so, yeah, we're really trying to build more infrastructure to get young people kind of working intergenerationally with adults that have time to volunteer and that have time to kind of provide them with some, um, you know, support, right? Because, you know, at the end of the day, we are privileging the activism power that young people bring to the table, and adults will learn the skills, right? And will be very important contributors, but the focus is always on how do we mentor our young people to be able to get on a hopefully lifelong path to civic leadership.
Yeah, and Quinn posted your email on the other platform, so thank you, Quinn. Yeah, and I'd say that I think it's interesting because, like, from the adult side, it's actually kind of simpler than people think, honestly. Like I did you know, mentoring for at-risk youth in ninth grade at local San Francisco high school when I lived there, and the training was like 2 hours, and it's kind of all you need, you know, and you can do it in less, honestly, because really the goal for the adult is kind of get out of the way most of the time and like listen and just be consistent and reliable and show up and, like, you know, check yourself, honestly, is kind of the core of it as the adult. Like, and I think adults, we often like, we're like, oh, I don't know what to do with these teenagers. Like, what am I going to do? It's like, well, a lot of it's just like back up, you know, and show up. And that's, you know, what it is. So I think we often make it out to be scarier than it is, you know, so it's good.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, like, you know, and I think that fear can be a little bit warranted because you don't want to misstep and things like that. But that's where, you know, our organization comes in. Like, we wouldn't just like, you know, have you sign up and then just like throw you to the wolves and without any sort of like preparation on how to create intergenerational space and work with young people that way. Like, we will definitely prime you well. And so yeah, definitely don't do it like, you know, there's so many like great resources out there for mentorship. Like, there's this organization called Mentor, that, you know, if you also have other places that you're plugged into young people and want to be a better mentor, that's a great place to start. But yeah, like, you know, the support systems do exist to connect adults that are passionate and that are inspired by what young people bring to the table and want to contribute to that development.
Yeah, it's worth doing. It's such a big skill, you know. It's like, I don't know, it's like if you care about where the future is going, just, you know, just getting engaged with one young person in your community, or like we said, like a child, a kid of, you know, a friend of yours, if you know, don't have kids, for example, like, or you're younger, you know, if you're, you know, early 20s, like, you're like, just get back in there if you can. You know, it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment, but just a little bit. Like, I was volunteering an hour a week, you know, and it made a difference. So it's not much. And then I think the last bit here is just like, so you're, you know, being heard by people who are, you know, in the fight against the two-party system and care about seeing all different kinds of candidates outside of that system be elevated, be able to make people matter more than money in our democracy, which is the mission, you know, of what we're doing. So just curious, any kind of final thoughts on ways for potential collaborations, you know, initiatives you would be interested in and excited about, or just any kind of final thoughts, you know, for this community of people?
Well, I definitely am interested in just continuing the conversation on how we can collaborate. I personally, I'm registered as a Democrat because I had to be. I live in DC. I don't know if folks know much about DC politics, but we do have Initiative 83 that would open up the primaries and also ranked choice voting as well. And so I like literally when I registered to vote, was like, I was like, I want to register. They're like, what do you want to register as? I was like, independent. And I was like, wait a minute, I can't vote in the primaries, right? If that's the case. And they're like, no. I'm like, damn it. So I had to force to be a registered Democrat. And if folks that are in similar boats, I'm sure we share that sentiment of how much that sucks, right? Like, that feels so undemocratic. I personally am really over the two-party system. And I'm someone who like, I would say I'm a pretty classic progressive. Like I used to maybe consider myself a leftist back in the day. I don't think I ever honestly was really a leftist. I don't think I even properly understood what leftism was, to be honest. I was just like, Marx, yeah, no, and I appreciate Marx a lot. I'm very like, try to be as anti-capitalist as possible. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm just very pro-democracy. And I think when you go too far, this is just my personal opinion. But I think if you go too far in either direction, that makes it challenging. We'll always have people that are far, right? And those voices, to a certain extent, if it's as long as it's, you're able to engage in society productively, right? And like not engage in like, violent tactics. I don't think that works. But that's a debate I'm more than willing to have. But I think I you know, I think it risks like when you go to the extremes, it really it risks democracy, right? And so I'm just someone who's super pro democracy, where I've come to the point where like as a person, on the ideological left, even though I don't really subscribe to the two-party system, um, I I no longer disparage conservatives. I don't do that. And it's so many people who are like actually more closer to the right than I am, like love bashing conservatives. I try not to do that as much as possible. I'm not saying I don't do it, but I really try to avoid doing it because and not to offend anyone who like also, aligns like on the conservative side. I think my point is that like I see where you're coming from. I understand the importance of a conservative ideology. Sometimes you're like, I can't pay for that. Right? Like I understand why former Governor Hogan vetoed that educational equity policy. We are not able to pay for it. It has not been implemented, right? I mean, I still think it's good that it passed so that we can try to get it funded. But I see what reasoning he was using to veto it, right? So I think my biggest advice is, I love this. I think this movement is right. I think we need to grow an independent movement. I think it's an absolute joke that we try to say that the US is a democracy and like the US kind of goes around and talks about like, other countries as not as democratic as the US, where like, a country like India can arguably be like, among the world's oldest democracies and like I mean, Indian politics, don't even get me started. But the fact of the matter is that like they have multiple parties, right? Like I think any country that has a multiple party system, kind of in some ways automatically feels like a better democratic system, in my opinion, than what we have here. So that's so I think growing the independent movement is so important. I think it also aligns with, what we're doing at the Youth Activism Project. We haven't actually personally had these conversations much yet, like because I said, the democracy reform stuff is really early stage for us. But the trend is that young people are increasingly identifying as independent, right? And so
majority actually, in a lot of
yeah,
polls. Yep.
yeah. And I think that actually provides me with a lot of hope, because I think people who identify as independents, like we are more inclined to engage in that type of like deliberative dialogue that I've been talking about. Um, First time framing it that way, but that is essentially what I've been like really, one of the key messages of my time tonight is like bravery and then that deliberative dialogue, which like to me really goes hand in hand, right? Because it is so much easier to like just respond to your triggers and yell at someone and feel justified in yelling at them and feeling morally righteous because you feel like you're on the right side. Fact of the matter is, people on both sides feel that way. And I understand why, people feel that way. The crux is, bringing it back to like Israel Palestine, for example. I understand why Israel is doing what it's doing and why Zionists feel the way they do. Like you have to understand that history. Same thing with like, the rise of like fascism in the US and like white supremacy. You have to understand it. It's not justifying it, but you have to understand it, and you have to frankly speaking, sympathize to a certain level and put yourself in those shoes so that you can try to figure out pathways to unity. Like, I'm not saying you're automatically going to find a pathway to unity with a white supremacist, but I'm saying like building that muscle, and that muscle for empathy, even though it hurts, even though it's hard, is like, I really do think it's one of the most important things that we can do. So my last thoughts is like, I'm super about this movement. It speaks to me at a deep level, and I'm super excited to continue the conversation.
Love it. This is great. And I think just to pull the final thread for me, at least, is like, you're just speaking so beautifully about representation, right? And like what it means to actually have a seat at the table. And, for young folks, that's a lot of what they, want, whether, and it's preparing them to take that seat and, mentoring them and supporting them and then getting out of the way when they're sitting in it, right? But we need to empower folks, of all ages to take on that representation and be represented. So just really grateful for the work you're doing. I love Katrina in the chat was
Can
like,
I answer your question though?
Yeah, yeah. Katrina said, "Are you running for office anytime soon?" in the chat.
Katrina, thank you. I am very flattered by that. And I do get folks, it's always flattering whenever folks ask me that question. And I've gone back and forth, and I'm never gonna say never about that. But what I realized, what I want my ultimate role to be in the movement is that, this goes back to my obsession with storytelling, which of course, like, plays a huge role in getting someone elected to office. But I just want to be the consummate storyteller. And by that, I mean, I want to be an artist. And I don't want to censor myself. Like, and so as an artist, like the best art is artists who can really speak from the heart. And so that's really the reasoning that I use for myself in terms of like why I don't want to run for office. Like, I really, really cannot censor myself. But I am here. I want to be a power broker. Like, if you want to run for office and I see the potential in you and I see, the fact that you have the capacity and the willingness to put up with politics, like, I will back you 100%. So I'm much more interested in seating future office holders than running myself.
Katrina says, "Never say never." Justin Bieber and Anika. That's awesome. Well, Anika, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and answering all of our community's questions and diving in and telling stories and just bringing it all together. I'm just very grateful for the work you're doing to cultivate this, leadership within, young people. And that's the future. I mean, it's funny. I think back to myself as being in that age, like, you're the future. And it's like, it's kind of cheesy, right? Like when I heard it back then, but I mean it very sincerely, when I say that. It's not just like a line. Like it goes really deep, and we really need people like you who do this work every day. So thank you.
I'd say the present too.
The present. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a better way to say it. I love that. Yes. That's really
Yeah.
great. Yeah. It's like now and tomorrow. Right.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's
Yeah.
beautiful. That's
Well, this was
wonderful.
awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I had such a blast talking to you all.
Yay. Thank you. More to come. Awesome. Thank you. This will kind of close, and then we can hop on the other one to quickly, say our goodbyes. But thank you. Thank you everyone who tuned in. Stay tuned. Check out Anika's work. And yeah, thank you so much.